Hey guys, we're back today to talk about how to determine exercise intensity. We want to learn how to challenge yourself without injuring yourself. In a past presentation, we covered the other three parts of the FITT formula: frequency, time, and type. And today, we're going to examine intensity. Our objectives are to look at the importance of exercise intensity. Why should we consider including that in our exercise plan? And we're going to determine the various methods of calculating exercise intensity. And there's different ones for aerobic exercise, and there are different ones for resistance training. And we're also going to look at some of the signs, the warning signs or signals that you're overtraining. Because remember, overtraining can lead to injury. So it's very important that we train at the appropriate intensity. So what is exercise intensity? It's really how hard you're working. It's the amount of energy that you use during your exercise session. So we have to find a balance between overloading the muscles and the cardiovascular system enough so that it can adapt to the exercise, and as it adapts, we can give it a little bit more and we can progress gradually. But we need a balance between that and overtraining, where we're working way too hard and have some warning signs that lead to burnout and possibly injury. The key is, if we're working too hard, we can get injured. And if we're working, it's not hard enough, if we're not challenging the body, then we're not able to progress. So we remain at a status quo. So when we measure exercise intensity, there are four main methods I'm going to discuss with you today: heart rate, the talk test, RPE, also known as ratings of perceived exertion, and the 1RM, also known as the 1 repetition max. When we look at heart rate to measure intensity, we truly use that method for aerobic exercise: walking, running, cycling, swimming, etc. The talk test is a test that can be used with any type of exercise, whether it's aerobic exercise or resistance training. RPE, or ratings of perceived exertion, can also be used with aerobic exercise and resistance training. And the 1 repetition max is reserved strictly for resistance training, working with weights. And I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail. So let's look at the heart rate. To determine our heart rate and to understand, why we use heart rate, usually whenever we increase our activity, our heart rate is going to naturally go up to compensate for that excess activity. So there's different ways that we can calculate how hard we're working. Now, if you were in an exercise physiology lab, the most accurate way to do it is doing a test called VO2 max. We can look at your volume of oxygen consumed. We can also look at your ventilatory threshold. Big words there. You're done in a laboratory, not feasible for the average person. So we have to come up with something that is the next best thing, and we can estimate how hard we're working using our heart rate based on the linear relationship between heart rate and work. The harder we work, the higher the heart rate. So there is a formula, and the Carbonin formula is a little bit more accurate. Some of the formulas use just your maximum age, heart rate based on your age, and multiply that by a percent of activity. The Carbonin formula uses the same principle, but it incorporates your resting heart rate, which takes into account individuality. Since we all have a different resting heart rate, we can calculate more accurately if we incorporate that into the formula. So this is known as the heart rate reserve method, or the Carbonin formula. So you have to figure out what your heart rate max is, and that's a simple formula of 220 minus the age. And if you didn't understand why 220 is used, think about this. When we're born as an infant, our heart rate max is about 220 beats per minute, and we lose about a beat per year. So that's why if you take the 220, which is the maximum at birth, minus what we lose per year, which is our age, we can come up with our maximum heart rate. Then you have to figure out the intensity. So when you're figuring out intensity, you have to determine, do you want a light workout, a moderate activity, or do you want vigorous activity? If you want a light workout, maybe you're a beginner, you'd work at 50 to 60% of your capacity. If you want to do a more moderate workout, maybe you're an intermediate level, 60 to 70% is a good guideline, and 70 to 85% is for more vigorous. Athletes may even be up to 95% or 100% of their maximum. But for all intents and purposes, let's assume that we are doing moderate activity. Then we would choose 60 to 70%. So you would use a formula where you're going to calculate your target heart rate range. And later in the presentation, I'll actually go through an example with you to give you an idea of how to use this formula. With the talk test, this is something you could do whether you're doing aerobic activity or if you're doing resistance training. It's very simple. As the name implies, you talk. See how I'm talking right now, and I can keep going, and I don't even barely have to take a breath because I'm doing no activity. I'm just sitting here. So we can use that as a gauge to know how hard we're working. Obviously, I'm not working very hard. So if you can sing while you're working out, singing takes a lot more energy than just talking, then you can say that activity is really, really light. If you can talk through the workout, but the breathing is maybe slightly harder than what I'm doing right now, you can say it's a moderate activity. If you can talk, but you really have to stop every once in a while and catch your breath, and you can't talk continuously like I am, now you're doing vigorous activity. And if you cannot talk at all, you've reached your maximum and you just can't really go on much longer. So the talk test is a general way to determine if we're working light, moderate, vigorous, or at a maximum intensity. And again, you can use that with aerobic and resistance training as well. The Ratings of Perceived Exertion Scale, also known as RPE, it is a very subjective tool. So because you are determining what your exertion is based on your perception of how hard you're working, you have to be really honest. Can't be macho here and say, oh yeah, no, this is easy, I'm good. You have to really be honest. So on a scale from 1 to 10, if you say you're about a 1, that means you're really doing little to no activity. I'm at a 1 right now on a Ratings of Perceived Exertion. 2 to 3 is light, means you can go on for a long time, and it's very easy to breathe. You can carry on a conversation, so really not working hard at all. 4 to 6 is moderate. You can maintain your activity indefinitely, but the breathing's getting a little bit heavier. You still can have a conversation, but it's not quite as easy. 7 to 8 is vigorous, and it's becoming uncomfortable, and you're breathing heavy, but you're still able to talk. And we're at a 10, we're at a maximum effort. Really, it's impossible to continue. Can't exercise anymore, can't have a conversation. You're pretty much done. So we can look at a scale from 1 to 10, or there are ways we can look at a scale from same type of exertion levels and same type of physical signs, but the level would be from 6 to 20. And you might be wondering, why would a scale be from 6 to 20? That's known as the Borg scale. And the guy by the name of Borg invented that because he said that since working is very, very linear with your heart rate, so as the harder you work, the higher the heart rate, well, let's base it on your heart rate. Most people have, let's say, an average resting heart rate of about 60 beats per minute, and a maximum beat per minute would, let's say, be 200. And so the scale goes from 6 to 20. So if you're working at 6, which is equivalent to 1 or very light, it's little to no activity, just multiply 6 by 10, and it's 60 or 60 beats per minute. So if I'm sitting here at very, very light, my exertion is little to no activity. If I were to take my heart rate, it would probably be around 60 beats per minute. And again, these are generalizations, but that's how the scale works. If I say I'm on a 20 on that scale, multiply that by 10, my heart rate's going 200 beats per minute, I'm at a maximum. I can't go anymore. So you can look at a scale from 1 to 10 or the Borg scale from 6 to 20 where it relates to your heart rate. Either way, the higher the number on the scale, the harder you're working and the higher your heart rate is. So, as I mentioned before, with heart rate, we're doing that specifically for aerobic activity. With the talk test and the RPE, we can do that either with aerobic activity or with resistance training. But when we look at the 1RM or the 1 repetition max, that's strictly for resistance training. So when we look at 1RM, it is the maximum amount of weight you can lift one time. So if I were going to do a bench press and I had a barbell and had 100 pounds on it. I hope I can do more than 100 pounds, but in case that's my maximum, that means I can lift that one time I could do one chest press, and after that, I can't lift it anymore. So that's known as my 1 repetition max, or my 1 RM. You can test some major muscle groups and find out what your 1 RM is for all those muscle groups and take a percentage of it. It kind of works like heart rate, but instead of taking a percentage of heart rate, you're taking the percentage of 1 RM. So if you want to do a light workout, maybe 65% of 1 RM, moderate 75%, and the more vigorous 85%. So when you're trying to figure out your intensity for an exercise plan, you have to determine what you're looking for. Are you looking to build strength, or are you looking to work on endurance in that session? If you want to work on endurance, then you can reduce the amount of weight. So you're going to take a smaller percentage of your 1 repetition max and do more repetitions. So you might use maybe 40 pounds and do 15 repetitions. Or you want to do more strength training, then you could do more weight and less reps. So maybe you'll do 80 pounds, which is about 80% of your 1 RM, and maybe only do 4 to 6 reps. So again, looking at the heart rate, I wanted to give you an example. If we took a 55-year-old person who's looking to determine how hard they need to work with regard to an aerobic activity, running, swimming, walking, jogging, elliptical, cycling, whatever, then they would use this target heart rate range formula, which equals your heart rate max minus your heart rate at rest times the percent intensity plus your heart rate at rest. Basic math, hope you remember your algebra and the rules, but it's a basic formula. So if we determine that this 55-year-old person has a heart rate at rest of 60 beats per minute, and they want to work at a moderate intensity, say 60 to 70%, we can calculate a range so that they know where to keep their heart rate between a 60 and 70% range. So the maximum heart rate for a 55-year-old person is 220 minus their age of 55, or 165. So remember what I said about including the resting heart rate. So that makes it more individual because this person's resting heart rate might be different than somebody else's. So at 60 beats per minute, we know that to begin this formula, we have to take our maximum heart rate and subtract our heart rate at rest. So we would take the 165 minus the 60, which is the resting heart rate, times the first intensity level of 60%, and then add back in the resting heart rate of 60. And when we calculate that formula, it comes out to 123 beats per minute. Do the same thing again to find out how hard we're working at 70% of our max. So we take the heart rate max of 165, remember 220 minus 55 is 165, minus the heart rate at rest, which is 60, multiply it now by 70%, and add back in the resting heart rate of 60. And when we do that calculation, it comes out to 134 beats per minute. So what that means is if I am a 55-year-old person and my resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute, when I'm working out, if I want to work at 60 to 70% of my maximum, which is a moderate intensity, I want to keep my heart rate somewhere between 123 and 134 beats per minute. Again, it's an estimate. And it can be different depending on different things, with your own physiology, but it's a good estimate to use. So you have to know how to calculate your heart rate. If you're fortunate enough to have a heart rate monitor that you can wear either as a watch or a chest strap or whatever type of monitor you have, and it monitors your beats per minute, that's great. Then you can just check your monitor and make sure you're staying within the 123 to 134. What that means is if you go below the 123, you're not working hard enough. And if you go above the 134, you're working harder than your 70%. So you're no longer in a moderate activity, getting more to a vigorous. So if you're a beginner who's never exercised before, you're not going to want to be up there. You might want to be at 50 to 60% of your maximum heart rate. If you're an intermediate level, then this moderate intensity is fine. If you're an athlete, this is not going to be hard enough. You need to work more at 90 to 95% of your maximum heart rate, or maybe even beyond that, depending on your level of athletics. So When you're figuring out your heart rate, if you don't have one of those monitors, then you need to calculate your heart rate yourself. There are two arteries that we use to calculate heart rate. One is the carotid artery, which is found in your neck, and the other is the radial artery found in your wrist. Now, I want to caution you about taking your heart rate using the carotid artery in the neck. Right in the middle of our neck, we have our trachea. And if you feel the trachea or your windpipe, on either side there's a groove next to a muscle, big muscle in your neck, sternocleidomastoid muscle. Say that 5 times fast. But in between the trachea and the muscle, there's a groove. And in between the groove on either side of the windpipe is your carotid artery. Now, some people will take their heart rate and they go like this. Never do this. Because if I'm compressing both arteries, guess what's going to happen? Since these are the only arteries that feed my brain, there'll be no blood getting to my brain, meaning there'll be no oxygen getting to my brain, and I'm going to pass out. So if you do choose to use the carotid artery, because it is easier to find as it is a bigger artery than the radial artery in your wrist, make sure you use your 2 fingers, index and middle finger. You don't want to use your thumb because your thumb has its own pulse and it can be a little confusing. And lightly compress. Do not press too hard because that slows down your heart rate. Just press it gently. When you find your pulse, you begin counting. You start at 0, not at 1. Start at 0 and count for up to 10. And when you get to 10, you stop and figure out how many beats per minute were there in those 10 seconds. So you're counting from starting at 0, counting for 10 seconds. You get a number. Let's say that number is 100. Now, 100, or maybe it's 20, whatever the number is. You take that number and you multiply it by 6, as there are 60 seconds in a minute. So if you're counting for 10 seconds, you have to multiply by 6 to get 10 times 6 or 60 seconds. So let's say it was 20 beats per minute. 20 beats after 10 seconds, multiply that by 6, it's 120 beats. So that's one way to calculate, or you can use your radial artery in your wrist. It's very hard to find this, but if you take the edge of your thumb and kind of slide your fingers down and get into the groove in between the tendons in the wrist, you'll find a groove, and right in there is your radial artery. And you can use the same method. Start at 0, count for 10 seconds, whatever that number is, multiply it by 6. That's how you take a heart rate. And starting at 0, count is a better, a more accurate, because you might be in the middle of a cardiac cycle, not at the very, very beginning of a beat. So you want to catch it starting at 0, and it'll compensate for the whole cardiac cycle. Another conversation for another time, but trust me, it's a more valid method. With the 1RM, when you are thinking about doing that as a test to figure out your intensity level for weight training, get all of your major tests done for your major muscle groups. When you're warm up at 50% of your maximum. Same for aerobic activity. You always want to warm up and do 50% of your maximum intensity. With weight training, as you start progressing, you can increase 5% depending, on the amount that you're lifting. So if you get to 12 repetitions, that's starting to be too easy for you. The weight that you're doing is a little light, so you can increase it by 5%. So here's an example. Let's say I can bench press, as I said earlier, 100 pounds. That's my 1RM. Can't lift any more than that. 65% of that, which be a light workout, is about 65%, and I can do 10 repetitions usually at that load. And that's just if you're looking for general toning. If you want to get more into working harder, getting more into strength, a more moderate activity would be 75% or 75 pounds, and I could do about 6 to 8 reps at that intensity. But if I'm really looking for strength, I want to keep that weight even higher at 85% of 1RM or 85 pounds, and that would equal about 4 to 6 reps. So it can get confusing. There's a lot that goes into determining intensity. It's a science. I mean, that's why there are degrees in exercise science and exercise physiology, because there's a lot involved. So hopefully I didn't confuse you too much with this. And if you do have issues, you contact a fitness professional, and anyone can work this through with you and get you to where you need to be. So now we have to look at some of the warning signs that come with intensity. Remember what I said earlier, that it's very important to challenge ourselves, but we don't want to over challenge. When we over challenge, we overtrain. Overtraining leads to burnout. Burnout can lead to injury. And you just don't feel good. You don't even want to work out anymore because you're just exhausted and everything is hurting. So some things you should look for to show, give you a warning sign, the sign that you're working too hard during your workout is if you have extreme breathlessness. I'm not talking about just a little bit out of breath, which is normal when you're working hard, but I'm talking about really, really heavy, intense breathlessness that you just really can't catch your breath. Or if you're wheezing and coughing. Chest pain or pressure in your chest of any type is a sign and you should stop immediately. Or if you're nauseous, that's another sign that you're working too hard. Extreme sweating, and some people really sweat because that's just their physiology. But if you're a person that doesn't really sweat that much and you are sweating profusely, that could be a warning sign you're working too hard. And if you have any type of dizziness or fainting, any type of severe muscle or joint pain or muscle cramps, those are signs that you went beyond your limit. You're really working too hard. And if you have extreme fatigue after a workout, or if it lasts for a long time, that's a sign that your intensity is too hard. You need to scale it back a bit. So you want that intensity high enough to challenge you, but you don't want it too high that it's going to make you sick and hurt you. So when you feel like the intensity is too low, you might start at a certain intensity, and after 2 weeks you realize, this doesn't feel the way it did 2 weeks ago. That's a sign that you need to progress. But remember to progress slowly. Increase your intensity slowly. You can increase the intensity by increasing the speed, or increase the duration, or increase the amount of reps, or maybe decrease the resting time in between sets. There are so many ways that you could work on increasing your intensity, but the point is to make sure that you do it gradually and work with a professional, because as I said before, it is a science and you have to find that balance between challenge yourself but avoiding injury. So in summary, intensity is the hardest part of the FITT formula to determine. Hopefully, this brief presentation gave you a general background of what to look for with intensity and what kind of measures to use, and also to understand that there's a progression with training. We don't want to plateau. We want to keep going, and intensity really helps us in figuring out how to get to that next level. Be mindful of the different methods of intensity, measuring intensity, but also know that they're estimates. They're not accurate as they would be if you were in a laboratory. And always beware the warning signs of overtraining, because overtraining could lead to injury, and then you're done. You can't work out until you heal, and sometimes you never heal if the injury is bad enough. So hopefully that helped you. And if you have any questions or would like to learn more about how to calculate intensity, or would like help with putting together an exercise plan, feel free to contact us.